Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast featuring real conversations with conscious objectors to the status quo. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, Evelyn Kim joins us for a conversation about the journey to embracing her expansive, queer sexuality and navigating the intersection of her Korean American identity. Together, we talk about the shadow sides of the LGBTQIA and social justice movements, contradictions in cultural identities, and letting people have their own experience of us. Y'all, this episode is all about contradictions and paradox, and I had such a fun time getting to talk to Evelyn, who has clearly done significant emotional, interpersonal work to understand how she shows up in space and the boundaries between what are other people's experiences of her and what is her own experience, right? How do we separate and let go of the desire to control how other people are perceiving us? Part of that resides in having a strong sense of self and knowing how you want to show up in the world. And it is clear that Evelyn is doing just that with the way that she shows up with continuous compassion and empathy for the different journeys that we're all on, including Evelyn and including myself, right? We're all along a path, just figuring it out, doing our best. And so I think y'all are really going to enjoy this conversation today with Evelyn and learn so much from her wisdom. So y'all, tune in. Do you have any questions about the podcast before we start, about me, anything that's coming up for you?
No, I just want to dive deep into the recording and talking. Yeah.
Okay. So where do you want to dive into?
Yeah. So I know where I want to start. So as I
Yeah.
told you in my email that I sent to you, I wanted to talk about this idea of contradictions, contradictions in our experiences and in culture and social movements. And I specifically want to talk about how personally in my life, the presence of those contradictions has helped me to be more understanding and more compassionate towards people in my personal life. And one example of this is when I went to my first Pride party a couple of years back. I think it was actually in 2016, so 6 years ago. I was very excited because I hadn't gone to a Pride parade or a Pride event at that time in New York City before. And it was really interesting to be there because I was meeting new people in the Pride party, and I was talking to this individual who was interested in my romantic relationship, and that person referred to my partner with they them pronouns. And after I said, "Oh, actually, my partner goes by he him pronouns," and their response was, "Oh, are you straight?" And I was bewildered at that question because I hadn't expected that response from this person. So yeah, I was bewildered and taken back. But then I responded by saying, "Oh, actually, I'm pansexual. I'm queer." Yeah. And after that experience, and as I was reflecting on it, I thought that yes, I was bewildered, and I also thought about how mentally we do want to find shortcuts to understanding things and people. And I think that's what happened with this acquaintance that I was meeting. I understand that this person assumed that I was heterosexual because that is the conclusion that we easily go to when we imagine someone who's more masculine presenting and someone who's more feminine presenting. If they're romantically together, we think both of them must be heterosexual. So I understand that that's the conclusion that my acquaintance came to when I met them at the party. But I think this experience led me to see that contradiction because when you think about the LGBTQ space, when you think about queer spaces, they have a culture of being open, right? Of being accepting. yet in this moment, I did initially have this experience of being boxed in or being a bit cornered. So that was
Absolutely.
the contradiction that I experienced in that moment.
Mm,
But I'm glad that after doing some self reflection and reflecting on that experience, I was able to be more understanding of this person, that,
mm.
their mind wanted to quickly make sense of me and my sexual orientation.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I understood that. And also know from this experience that there are so many ways to be queer. There's so many ways to be LGBTQ. And we just cannot infer a person's sexual orientation through who their partner is. Yeah. The
Mhm.
most accurate way to know that is to simply ask.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's like that person made a major assumption just based on hearing the pronouns of your partner.
Right.
Mm, yeah.
Yeah. So I was taken aback. Initially, that was my response. And I'm also glad that even though I was blindsided by what this person said, I was
Mhm.
able to further my understanding of what being queer means,
Yeah.
what it can look like, how it can be so varied and nuanced.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
What does being queer mean to you? I'd love to hear.
Thank you. Thanks for
Yeah,
asking me that.
of
So,
course.
to me, being queer to me means having clear self knowledge, knowing
Mm,
yourself clearly. It means courage
mm,
because it takes a lot of courage to think of your sexual orientation in ways that you're not used to, because that can be a disorienting experience initially.
absolutely.
Yeah, so
Mhm.
being queer to me means courage and it means clear self-knowledge.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It can be so scary to challenge, the status quo, the normativity of, heterosexual life. And to challenge that means stepping out into your own self, your own feelings, and to trust that can be
Yeah,
incredibly scary.
right, right.
Yeah, yeah. When did you come into your queerness? If you'd mind sharing with me, like, is there a story of courage and bravery for you in that journey?
Yeah, I don't mind sharing
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah, if
So,
you're willing.
sure. It's been a really long time since I've shared this story with other
Mm.
people. So I need a moment to think back and
Mhm.
articulate this. Yeah, to because I want to share this with you in a fluid
Mhm.
way.
Yeah, of course.
So I'm currently pansexual.
Mhm.
I am a cisgender woman, femme who is pansexual. I first came out as bisexual in 2016.
Mhm.
So when I was still living in New York, yeah, and that actually was the year that I went to the Pride Parade and the party that I told you about.
Sure.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So I had come out not too long before that, and I think I took time to think about my sexual orientation when I found myself walking around Queens in New York City and pretty much checking out other women.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, because there are actually a lot of very stylish, fashionable, beautiful people around in New York City.
Mhm.
And I unconsciously just sense myself doing a double take like, wow, this person is gorgeous or this person is
Yeah.
beautiful. And I didn't think too much of my reaction at first. But
Mm.
then when I gave myself that room to self reflect, I thought, I'm wondering if I am attracted to women, And I realized that I was, yeah, that I did have this attraction to women. And that is how my revelation started. It started
Mhm.
off as my understanding that I am attracted to people who share my gender. And then I gained more clarity and realized that I'm attracted to people of all genders.
Mhm.
So cisgender and transgender women, cisgender, transgender men, genderqueer people. So I know now that gender expression and identity, they don't have a bearing on who I'm attracted to. So that's where I'm at now.
Yeah, definitely, which is a beautiful journey to come to that level of expansion. It sounds like you felt it in your body maybe in some way before maybe you even
Yes.
consciously knew what was happening. You said unconscious, yeah, and then taking
Yes.
that time to process seemed to clear what that was coming up for you, which was sexual attraction.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, as you were coming into your bisexuality, coming from my personal experience, I have something similar, right? Of going from bi to a little bit more expansive. And what I noticed in that experience was also how much my value system and what I saw of the world and what I found attractive really changed. I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on that. Like, I've noticed like gender fluid people are very attractive to me in ways that maybe when I was first coming out, I wasn't even like psychologically able to understand that. You know what I mean? I don't know how to say that, but like I just hadn't thought about these ideas in that way to even like open up my sense of attraction. I don't, I feel if you feel me.
I do feel
Yeah.
you. Yeah. That was my experience as well.
Okay.
Because as I mentioned before, when I acknowledged my queerness, I came out to myself as bisexual, meaning, and to me, what that meant was I'm attracted to people who share my gender, women who are cisgender and transgender, and also I'm attracted to men who are cisgender and transgender. And that was my definition of bisexuality, because at that point, I hadn't had much experience interacting with non-binary people or
Exactly.
genderqueer people.
Yep.
So that's the reason that was my definition of bisexuality, and it accurately reflected my experiences and how I saw myself at the time. And since then, I have interacted with non-binary people and genderqueer people, and I had new experiences of being drawn to them, of thinking, wow, they're beautiful, and I really find them attractive,
Absolutely.
So I think that's why my own queerness and my sense of it did expand and did change.
Yeah, and even that, I think it requires us to hold space for the
Absolutely.
fluidity of our own sexuality.
Absolutely. Yeah. There's one thing that I forgot to mention about my experience at
Tell
the
me.
Pride party. Yeah, that I wanted to talk about. And so the thing that I wanted to mention is that I love being in the LGBTQ community. I love that there is so much positivity and so much love. Yeah. And that is what I felt at the Pride Parade and at the Pride Party for sure. And I also want to bring to light that so I believe that everything and every person has its positive aspects and its negative aspects, its positive side and its shadow side. And I think it's important to acknowledge both. And a shadow side of the LGBTQ movement that I want to talk about is I personally sense that being heterosexual is somehow less than being queer. I've felt this opinion and this vibe in specific queer spaces. And I think it was interesting to experience because I thought, I want to understand this perspective. And I realized that, okay, I get it if people in the LGBTQ community think that if you're queer or if you have these specific identities, then you're more progressive or you're better, I say I understand this perspective because maybe the folks who hold this perspective want to feel good about themselves, perhaps they want to affirm themselves and give themselves assurance. And at the same time, I also want to say that I think whether we are LGBTQ or whether we are heterosexual or have any sexual orientation, I think it's just important that it accurately reflects who we are and our sense of ourselves.
Yeah, it seems like sometimes there's almost this assumption that if someone's heterosexual, they just haven't explored themselves deep enough. They haven't, been open enough to this. So in that way, I think there might be that, sort of assumption that they haven't expanded, enough
Sure.
to just be open. So yeah, there
Yeah.
could be that negative look on heterosexuality, which is just another sexual orientation.
Right, right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think it's really important to acknowledge all these facets and elements of the LGBTQ community and movement.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. It's interesting what's coming up to me right now is I'm feeling this sense that sometimes I find myself doing this with the concept of heterosexuality when I refer to people that I'm dating, and in a way to kind of say, yeah, they haven't challenged a lot of concepts of norms. Which I guess is reinforcing this pattern, right? So I'll say to my friends, like, oh, I went on a date and like he's like a cis het man. And by that meaning something, which it is, he's less progressive in some way. So I can feel myself that I do this, but not in the connotation of saying that there's something wrong with that, but trying to also say that, like, that's why I didn't want to go on another date, because I can't, the way that they interact with the world is fundamentally different. And that shows up in small little things of like how they interact with me and hold space, maybe like interrupting or doing things that are assumed gender norms and stuff, which is just, I don't know if you, yeah, like I find myself doing this, but
Thank you for
like,
your honesty.
yeah, absolutely. But not wanting
Yeah,
to be like, they're not progressive. It's just like, it's a different paradigm almost. Do you know what I mean?
I hear you.
Yeah.
I think that it's valid and totally legitimate to speak from our own personal
Yeah.
experiences of people of different sexual orientations. And I also have learned to be more mindful of making blanket statements
Yeah,
about
absolutely.
groups of people,
Yep.
because as you and I both know, people are so different and varied in the way they experience themselves, their sexual orientation.
Yeah.
So I think it's one thing to have a specific experience with someone with a certain sexual orientation, and it's a different thing to make a general statement. I think that honesty and also understanding the nuances that people hold is really important.
Absolutely. And I have met some cis het men that are amazing, right? And I feel
Yeah.
safe with them. I feel like they're not trying to enact power dynamics that I frequently see out in the world with people. And so in those spaces, yeah, I think it's an interesting thing then to like maybe for me to take that step back and kind of acknowledge the ways that in that shortening of trying to explain how my date was with this person, I'm like reenacting a negative connotation on that whole blanket group of people. It's just, yeah. Yeah, I think this is important to talk about in the language that we use, because I've seen some of this on Hinge with people, some queers who will be like, you should not go out with me if you're a cis het person,
Mm-hmm.
cis het man. Like,
Mm.
exactly. And what are you saying by that?
Right, right. That's a great question, because the question that you're posing right now, Nicole, it shows us that we say so much with our verbal words, but we
Mm-hmm.
also make a statement with what we don't say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then is this reinforcing, there's like almost, yeah, there's not enough space for heterosexuals by doing that. Cis
I hear you.
heterosexuals.
I
Yeah.
hear you.
Mm.
So I want to shift our conversation
Oh,
to a
sure.
different aspect of my
Yeah.
identity, if you're
Sure.
all
Let's
right with
do it.
that.
Yeah. Let's do it.
Yeah, so as I told you, I experience contradictions when it comes to my queer identity, and I've also experienced this with my cultural identity and my
Mm.
ethnic background.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to talk about that as well, because it's a very important part of my life and
Absolutely.
my experience of myself. So, as I mentioned to you before, I'm Korean American. My folks are from South Korea. They immigrated here in the 80s. I was born in the US, and it was a year ago when I understood that there is this contradiction in my cultural identity as a Korean American,
Mm-hmm.
because of the history that the US and South Korea share, or the
Mm.
history that the US and the Korean Peninsula share. So, something that I recently learned was that during the Korean War, the United States, this country's armed forces dropped 600,000 tons of bombs on the Korean Peninsula. And that caused a lot of damage and a lot of trauma at that time. And it took a while for me to unpack that, because I needed to come to terms with the fact that my parents immigrated to the country whose armed forces damaged their homeland, that caused a lot of trauma in their homeland. So that is a paradox.
Absolutely.
You know? And this also relates to my developing understanding of North Korea. So talking about North Korea, as I'm sure you're aware, is a very polarizing topic. And I think North Korea is important for me to talk about, because when I look at pictures of the people living there, I see myself. I see people who share my ethnicity. So it's like they're like me, you know? And I mention North Korea because I recently learned that the reason that North Korea has so much tension with the US is because of this history. It's because the US's armed forces caused so much damage to their land that North Korea has this resentment. And when I think about that, I'm like, I understand, you know, I understand that. I understand that resentment and that hurt. I also understand that if a North Korean person were to meet me, you know, someone who speaks their language, but someone who's born in the US, I think they would be shocked, or maybe they would see me as a traitor, or maybe they just wouldn't be able to wrap their minds around the fact that I'm a Korean person who grew up in the US. Yeah, that's very possible. Yeah. And I understand that. Yeah. So I think that I've learned to make peace with the contradiction in this cultural identity that I have, you know. I have learned to sit with it, as uncomfortable and weird as it is. And I also have been thinking about the privileges that I've had because I have a US passport and I was born and grew up in the US. So one privilege that I have as a result of that is I'm an English speaker. And that is an immense privilege, because when I go to another country, most countries in the world, I can get around easily because I'm an English speaker. And someone whose first language isn't English would have a different experience of a different country. And I also am thinking about how maybe some really passionate folks listening to me might be like, well, since you're saying this, why don't you like go back to Korea or something like that? Like, why don't you like leave this place? And to them, I would say, well, I can say these things about North Korea and also acknowledge that I've been blessed to be in this country. I've been blessed to experience a high standard of living and learn English. And it's a deep process of self-reckoning and understanding myself to sit with these paradoxes.
Absolutely. I mean, yes. I mean, you grew up here. That question hurts me to hear that even someone would say that to you. I'm having a reaction on my own part that someone would even think that to say that to you. Yeah. I'm also thinking about traitor. I mean, that's such a tough word to hold, to know that someone might think that of you for feeling the way that you do about your lived experience.
Yeah. When I think about that, I think that it's an intense word, you know, an intense label to put on somebody. And I also know that if someone were to ever say that to me directly or label me that way directly, or even suggest it through their body language or their approach to me, I would be flustered, and I would always, as I've said before, want to come back to that place of understanding, you know. Maybe I'm beyond their their understanding or their point of reference of what a person like me could be or think or believe.
Yeah, it sounds like coming back to this sort of experience with compassion.
Definitely.
Yeah. Compassion for maybe where they're at that time to understand your complexities.
Totally. I think that when people have strong reactions to who we are, it may be because we are beyond their understanding. We are beyond their point of reference. And I would say that it's okay for us to be beyond what somebody can understand. That is absolutely okay. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. I mean, we can take up all the space that we need to be ourselves and should damn well take up that space.
Of course. And when someone is emotionally triggered by that or has a strong reaction to that, meeting someone like me or you could very well be the doorway for them to expand their understanding of people and to expand their understanding of these contradictions that people carry.
Do you find yourself playing that role when you meet people?
I do every now and then. Yeah. And I am the type of person who is very mindful and considerate of another person's experience with me. So whenever someone is having a strong reaction to my presence, I sense it immediately. And though I sense it immediately, I also am growing in my ability to hold my ground and to be able to say, this is who I am. And even though you may be having a strong, uncomfortable response to it right now, I don't want to buckle. I want to be sincere. I want to be honest with how I show up in front of you.
That takes a lot of strength.
It does.
Yeah, my fawn response is hard. Like I just want to people please. What is the journey of getting to that level of strength for you?
That journey has definitely entailed understanding boundaries.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Having a lot of self-compassion and also differentiating between my experience and someone else's experience, where I start and end and where the other person begins.
Can you say more about that?
Sure.
Yeah.
So when I was a teenager and a young adult, I found myself in very emotionally intense interactions, partially because I wanted to caretake other people's emotions.
Ooh, speaking to me, I'm listening. Yes.
Because I was so invested in having the conversation be pleasant and be harmonious, I had this approach of, oh, you're uncomfortable with me? Let me fix that. Let me do something to change that. But when I look back at those kinds of interactions I've had, I realized that that was at my expense. That was at the expense of my sincerity.
Yep, absolutely.
And my showing up honestly. And in those interactions, I knew that I was mixing up my stuff and the other person's stuff. Yeah. So once I realized that I could draw the line somewhere, that I could draw the line between someone's stuff, someone's personal experience and mine, I had a stronger ability to let people have their own experience of me, regardless of what it is.
Yeah, that is something that we are always trying to hold on so tightly to control how other people perceive us. You know, I'll say this, I'll do that so that they think this about me, and to let that go because it sounds like you know who you are.
Right.
That's very strong. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's a process for sure. It's a process. It is an unfolding of yourself. It is this gradual evolution of understanding what you're about, understanding how you want to show up in the world,
Absolutely.
and also advocating for yourself, taking care of yourself. That is what this process has been like for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Because I think that's maybe what's necessary for us to be able to suss out what is someone else's experience versus ours.
Right.
I know you said when you have a dynamic with someone and they're having a reaction, you sense it. Can you
Yes.
tell me more about how you sense it, and then because of that, how you suss out their stuff versus your stuff?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, whenever someone is having an unpleasant or negative experience of me,
Mhm.
even though they might not directly tell me that outright, I can still sense it through their tone of voice,
Yep.
through their body language, through what they say as well. And one example of this is when I've had experiences of people speak to me, and their tone to me was quite condescending.
Mm.
So one specific example of this is a job interview that I had 7 or 8 years ago.
Sure.
I got called in for an education coordinator role, and when I was in the interview, I sat with two other people, and one of them asked me, "So, what do you know about being an education coordinator?" And the other person was like, "Do you know what that is?" Do you
Excuse me.
know what that is? And even without them saying it outright, I knew that they were doubting me.
Yeah.
So I knew that I was not in the right place. That was the wrong
Absolutely.
place to be. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you sensed that and knew that, right? Because then, I might go into that situation and be like, "Oh yeah, well, of course I know. Like, let me show you," and like go back into that more, yeah, without that grounding in your sense of self to walk away and say, "This isn't the right space for me." So, someone else might fawn into that response and then try to prove. So,
Mm,
hell yeah, I'm glad you know that and feel that.
thank
Yes.
you. And I want to say that the fawning response is, I completely understand it because I've been there. And
Yeah.
I say I understand it because it makes sense that in that type of interaction that I just mentioned, you want to meet the moment, so to speak.
Yeah.
You want to convey that you are competent, that you
Mhm.
can meet the challenge.
Yeah.
And at the same time, from my experience, when I've responded in that way, I've experienced myself as feeling drained after that. It's feeling drained
Yes.
and very disoriented, like, what just happened? Like, what just happened?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So after I had those experiences, I knew that responding in that way was not healthy for me. And I would
Mhm.
rather preserve my energy and preserve my own peace.
And I think one important thing too is with jobs, that's totally a space where that happens. These are relationships. I think we kind of, oh, it's just work, but really you're interacting dynamics with other people. It's really important
Right.
to, protect yourself and be in environments that feel safe.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm curious, as you've been evolving that sense of self, what has your community looked like during that time? Has it shifted as you've changed?
Yes. So my community at that time was very dynamic
Mm,
and very robust because I was living in New York City at that time
mm,
from 2014 until 2018. So during the time of that job interview that I talked to you about, yes, I was living in New York City, and as a result of being in proximity to a lot of people, my social circle was pretty big and very dynamic.
mm,
And that was because of where I lived, and also because I was very active on Twitter. On that platform, I actually connected with a lot of Asian Americans like myself in the activist space, in the social
mhm.
justice space.
Yeah.
So my geographic location and my activity on Twitter at that time contributed to my community being what it was, being dynamic, being
Mhm.
pretty robust, and being very social justice and social consciousness focused. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. it has changed since then.
Mhm.
So since the pandemic began, I actually moved to New Jersey, and I've
Wow.
actually lived in a small town in the countryside in rural New Jersey. So it's been a completely different experience, and I've had immense amounts of solitude to myself. So it
Wow.
was just a complete 180 in the social experience.
I can imagine.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
So even though I've had my moments of missing my social life in New York City and missing the vitality of my life
Mhm.
there, I have reminded myself that this is a prime time for me to know
Mm.
myself, to get even more clear on who I am and how I'd like to show up in the world and in
Mhm.
my social relationships.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so that's how I'm making the most of my solitude here.
Mhm.
Yes,
Yeah, I feel like solitude is needed for that sense of self. Absolutely.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm thinking about how it's true that we can get clarity on ourselves in interacting with other people.
Oh,
And
100%.
I also think that what you're saying is on point, that when we have solitude, we can sit with ourselves, sit with our inner selves, and get clarity on that.
Mhm. Yeah, I think this is the paradox of the human experience, right? Is we need to be able to understand who we are in ourselves, and we also need and are dependent on other people.
Yes,
There is no pulling those 2 away, you know?
right.
We are social beings. We have relationships in our lives that shape
Absolutely.
us and provide the community that we need. So it's never like we're just gonna go live on a I mean, I guess you do. There are people that live completely isolated and find sense of relationships with nature and other things in their life, but I think we're always in relationship of some sort. And so
Definitely.
being able to recognize both of that, the individual and the community.
Yes,
And I know it doesn't make sense at the same time, but it does because that's our life. That's the paradox, right?
definitely.
Contradiction.
Yes, definitely. Definitely.
Mhm. Yeah. And so then it's for me, I find if I spend like a lot of time with a lot of other people, people are such mirrors to who we are. And I don't,
Totally.
your system of where you're at will change how you interact. And so depending on what communities you're in, you kind of almost feel a different sense of self to some degree. And so for me, I think it's so nice to be able to sit back in the solitude when it's just your mirror with yourself and you're able to see, yeah, how do I show up when I am completely at my own capacity, at my own will,
Right.
whatever comes up for me.
Totally.
So important.
Totally. Totally. And I definitely thank you for asking me about community, because
Yeah.
that was actually a great transition and segue into the third topic that I wanted to talk
Oh, yeah,
about.
let's go, yeah.
Sure, which was about the community, the social justice community that I was involved in when I was in New York City.
Mhm.
So, since the overarching theme of this talk is contradictions,
Yeah,
I want to talk about contradictions in relation to social justice movements.
absolutely.
And the main idea that I want to talk about from my personal experience is that my orientation towards social justice movements have shifted in terms of
Mm.
how I show up.
Oh, tell me.
So, as I told you, when I was living in New York City, I was very active on Twitter. I was showing up in person to events,
Mhm.
supporting Black Lives Matter, supporting gender justice and gender equality. And I was very passionate about the work, and
Mm.
I learned so much. And to this day, of course, I'm so appreciative of that time. And I also think about how I exited the space because of burnout,
Mhm.
because of burnout and because I was very discouraged. So I think this is one of the shadow sides, the hidden sides of social justice movements that is so important to talk about. One thing that I had a lot of questions around when I was active in this space was, how do we know when progress has happened? How do we know when we've gotten a win?
Mhm.
Because when I was involved in the space and passionately advocating for these different causes, I had this experience of devoting a lot of energy to these causes, but it seemed like the wins were very sparse, or the wins
Mm-hmm.
were not there, or there was something else, like another problem or another thing, like another issue. And
Absolutely.
I want to say that it's definitely important to identify the aspects of our culture and society that can shift for the better and improve. And I also think it's so important to celebrate the wins,
Mm.
to rest,
Yeah,
and to take care of ourselves as we are advocating and being activists for different causes that we care about.
absolutely. Yeah, because that care runs really deep. It's a part of your being. It's a part of how you see the world. It's how you love, how you want to interact in this space. And so, yeah, that can be so immensely tough when we have such big goals for the future that we want to see in our
Right,
community, and
right.
how frequently there's so many different barriers that are up in the way for that dream, space that we hope for humanity. So
Mhm.
yeah, for being able to bring it back down to the small moments of wins, I think is a really important thing to focus on.
Totally, totally.
Yeah.
I think that the vision that people hold, that we hold of having a better world, a better society is
Yeah.
beautiful, and it's
Yeah.
so needed. We need that vision
Yes.
to pull us forward. And at the same time, I think that it's important to not get discouraged by the obstacles and the barriers that are present.
Mhm.
And as you said, it's important to celebrate regularly,
Yeah.
because that can be encouraging and affirming
Mhm.
for everybody in the space.
Mhm. Yeah. So then for you, as you were grappling with this, now how do you take care of yourself as an activist and someone that is in that space? What do you do for yourself to know?
Yeah, so now I think about how I can show up
Mm.
to the causes that I care about in ways that are joyful for me and that are sincere,
Mhm.
meaning I want to show up in social justice spaces in a sincere way and also in a joyful way too, in a way that says, I'm glad to be here. What can I do? I'm
Mm.
glad to be here. How can I use my strengths to encourage other people, to affirm this vision that we have of a better society, of a more socially conscious and compassionate culture?
Mhm.
And I'm thinking about how over the years I have gone from being very active physically,
Mhm.
marching on the streets in
Yeah.
Brooklyn, in New York City for different causes, to being more internal. So the way that I've showed up has changed, but the
Mhm.
level of support that I have inside of me for these different causes is the same. It's the
Yeah.
same. It's just has always been there. And I think that this is important to talk about because when I was actively marching, someone told me, Evelyn, remember that the most vocal supporters of these causes could be the people who aren't even here. This is
Mm.
what my dating partner told me, what my romantic partner told me. This is what he said. And I was like, that is true. That is definitely true. And what he said that day to me has stuck with me,
Mm.
because it can be easy for us to think that the people who are marching on the streets are the most passionate supporters, are the ones who are 100% on board. That could be true, but at the same time, the people who aren't there could be just as passionate and just as supportive of this cause.
Absolutely. I think what you're touching on too, at least how I'm understanding it, is the multiple ways that we can bring about a better future. Right? There is
Yes.
marching in the streets, and there is also the relationships that you have in your life. And I'm sure that we kind of talked on this earlier, right? You being that person that it brings up emotions for other people, but for you to still come back with compassion and love, you're doing that exact radical act of choosing love, compassion, and in that changing the society whether you're marching on the streets or not. Like, there's different ways to bring about this dynamic and to change the world around us.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I so appreciate you mentioning choosing love and choosing compassion, because another contradiction that I see in social justice movements is that when we take a stand against specific
Mhm.
injustices, when we take a stand against hate, for example, I have seen people embody that very same hate that they claim to be against. So, one example of this is
Yeah.
I saw a video online, I think it was an Instagram reel, of somebody recording a beach scene. So, the person recording this video was on the beach, and you see a large tractor going across the beach, and the person riding the tractor or driving it has this huge Trump 2020 sign on it. And the person who's recording this video is cursing
Mm.
at that tractor driver and is audibly angry and enraged. And in that moment, I thought it's clear that this person does not support Trump. And of course, Donald Trump has said so many hateful things about so many different communities. And when I looked at that video, I had to pause and think the person who recorded this video is most definitely against the hateful things that Trump has said,
Mhm.
but they've showed hate themselves in that moment. And I thought, yes, the anger is, there's a place for that. You know, it's important to process the anger that we feel, the grief that we feel around these topics and around these injustices. And at the same time, I think that it's important to transform that, to
Mhm.
transform the anger and the grief into our vision for what we want to see in the world. So I think it's one thing to say, I'm against racism and I'm against these injustices. I'm against police brutality against the Black community.
Yep.
It's one thing to say that, and it's another thing to say, I'm supportive of a socially conscious community. I am supportive of people being mindful of who they are and who other people are and
Mhm.
communicating with love and compassion. I think it's different. And I think that yes, there's a place for anger and grief, and it can be so heavy to carry, which is why I personally believe that at a certain point, it's important to transform that into what do we want to create? What kind of
Mhm.
world do we want to be in? It's important
Mhm.
to get to that point, I believe.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's what word would I use? It's not possible to think that we're ever going to be completely compassionate, loving all the time.
Right, we won't
In
be
exactly. Yeah, and
because
I
we're human. Yeah,
exactly. And
we
that's what
will
I
have our moments.
absolutely. And that is fair. That is part of our survival to defend against things that, are threatening to our sense of life and to come back with anger. That we can understand that. And I feel like what you're hitting on so beautifully is the importance of seeing the humanity, right? Like Trump supporter or not, that is another human that you're talking to. How can we focus on that? I understand that, there are threats to our bodily autonomy occurring, and
Yeah,
things like that, oh my
yeah,
god, I have every right to be absolutely furious with someone,
absolutely. Yeah,
but that is a human being. And one above all, like what are you going to get out of this dynamic? It's not going to achieve the world that you're dreaming of by yelling back at them.
right,
Not at
right.
all. So like what's the point here? I love that you're taking this pause to like say, yeah, I that feeling anger, yes, it makes sense. And how do we take that energy and direct it towards something that is going to get us closer to that vision of what we want?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Mhm. Yeah, that's tough. And I think that's a practice, right? That is a practice. And I feel like something that I'm constantly, as we're talking, that I'm hearing from you is this ability to be in space, to recognize what is coming up for you, and then to be able to pause enough to make the decision of how you want to show up and how you want to respond rather than reacting.
Yes. Yes. Thanks for acknowledging that.
Yeah, that's huge. And I feel like that's the only way we can do this work. And that's why I enjoy getting to talk to people like you who I can ask, how did you do this? How did you get to this space of being able to do that? And I feel like you've hit on many of the things. It sounds like solitude, community, having compassion for ourselves, even when we do things that we don't like, and to continually grow through that.
Right.
Yeah.
All of those things are so important.
Yeah. And above all, one of the things that has been coming to me too is remembering that we're also here to enjoy and to live and to have pleasure, right? I find myself
Exactly.
constantly getting this space of like analyzing, okay, how can I be better? How can I heal? How can I grow, versus remembering like, hey, that's a part of the capitalistic push too. Like,
Right.
we do our work and we're passionate about this, and we have joy. We let
Yes.
ourselves, enjoy the beauty of the world, of food, of pleasure, of all the things. So to hold
Absolutely.
that, yeah,
Absolutely.
that's something I've been trying to come into more, oriented to
Yes.
pleasure.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is so essential because there is a place for both.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Not one or the other, not toxic positivity, not all of this. I think this is the complexity of the human experience. Kind of
Right.
like you said earlier, people have good, bad, all of this. It's the yin and yang of life. Like we have all these contrasting things that are always in flow together. I always talk about quantum mechanics, the, light wave particle duality, the things that contradict but come together for the
Right.
fullness of life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I want to hold some space here in case I know you came in with a direction, but just in case there's anything lingering for you on your heart that you wanted to say or talk about before I come to our last closing question.
No, so there's nothing.
Good.
Our interview and our conversation feels complete to me.
Good. That's the feeling we want to have of that release. And I really appreciate you coming in with direction. That makes my job easy. I can just sit back and we can flow. So yes. Well, then let me ask you the one last question that I ask everyone on the podcast. What is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
No one has ever asked me this question, so I thank you for asking me this. One thing that I wish more people would know is normal is presence. And this actually relates to the last point you made about how our culture advocates for us being ambitious and growing personally and professionally in many ways. And I wish that more people would know that it is normal to be fully present in your experience of this life on earth. And we have every right to experience joy and to live our life as we grow and as we reach our goals.
Absolutely.
That is okay to do. And it's also important to live our life and to take it all in, to have a vibrant experience of our daily life.
Absolutely. You are worthy in the moments of joy, worthy in the moments of sadness, frustration, all of this. We never want to box ourselves off from the full array of emotions that come with being human.
Right.
Yeah, you're worthy and full of joy in all of that. So I think that's a very important thing. I like the word you used, presence in your full humanity.
Yes.
Yeah. That was beautiful.
Thank
really
you.
appreciated that. Yeah, it resonated with me. I closed my eyes and felt the words that you were saying. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you too, Nicole. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely. It's always so fun. It's a dance. And to me, just getting to share space with another human and talk and play. So thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Yeah. Is there anywhere you would want to plug to various things? To yourself, to your Twitter? I'm not sure what you do with your social media. If you're trying,
So I would like to direct people to my website.
Yeah.
I'm at evelynkim.com. Publicly, I am guiding people in their personal development as a holistic educator. I do tutoring and also through personal guidance sessions, which are very similar to life coaching.
Yeah.
I want to be available for people who want to incorporate more soul, more spark, more joy into their everyday life so that they can have maybe a different or more expansive experience of that. So they could reach me at my website.
Lovely, lovely. And then I'll make sure I have that in a link below so that way people can check it out. Yeah. Thank you for sharing space with me today.
Yes, you're welcome. And I thank you too.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you're a part of the Anarchist community, then follow us on Instagram or nominate a guest for the show by sending in a letter to modernanarchypodcast@gmail.com. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.